In the 1820s in Edinburgh, 5,000 medical students were learning surgery. But there was one problem nobody whispered about in daylight. There were nowhere near enough bodies to teach them on. So a quiet, dangerous economy grew up in the dark, and the men running it knew things most people never learned. They knew the scent of fresh-turned earth versus old clay, and they knew which watchman would look away for a coin. Tonight, you are one of them, and the city we are walking into looks, on the surface, perfectly ordinary. Before we settle in, if you enjoy these relaxing journeys into the past, like the video and subscribe for more quiet history evenings. If there's a part of today you want to let go, or a memory tonight brings back, share it below. Now let's get comfortable and ease into tonight's journey. Edinburgh, on the surface, sounds like any other city on a grey afternoon. A woman sells bread from a basket near the corner, calling out her price in a flat, tired voice. Children cut between people's legs on the cobbles, chasing something or each other. It is hard to tell. Somewhere above the rooftops, a church bell counts the hour slowly, each ring hanging in the damp air before it fades. The smell is coal smoke and wet stone, and something faintly animal from the street. You pull your coat tighter because the cold here has a particular quality, not sharp, but heavy, like the air itself has weight. Edinburgh in the 1820s climbs upward in a way that catches you off guard if you have never seen it before. The old town stacks its buildings so tall they block out what little grey sky there is, and the closes, the narrow passages that cut between the buildings, run downhill into shadow, so deep that even on a bright afternoon the bottom of them stays dark, the stone walls pressing close on both sides as people move through them in single file. People live stacked on top of each other, floor after floor, in tenements so high they sway slightly in a strong wind, or so people say. The city is loud and crowded and smells of itself, and walking through it, it feels like a place that is always awake, always moving. So you almost miss it. Almost. As you pass one of the churchyards, you slow down without really deciding to. Your hand brushes the gate as you stop, and the iron is cold in a way that goes straight through your glove. The kind of cold that has been sitting in metal all day with nowhere to go. The gate is open and the graves are where you would expect them, but beside one of the newer mounds of earth, maybe 3 meters from the gate, 2 people are sitting on the grass, wrapped in heavy coats, one of them with a blanket across their knees, both of them watching the ground in front of them with the steady, patient look of people who have decided they are not moving. They are not praying. They are not crying. They are guarding a grave. Further back near the east wall, you can make out another figure sitting on a low stone, a man with his hands folded, facing the newer section of the yard. It is the middle of the afternoon. These people sat down this morning, and they will still be here when the light goes out. Because in the 1820s, Edinburgh, a fresh grave left alone overnight, was at real risk. Not of anything supernatural, of something much more practical, and in its own way, much stranger. The city was home to several anatomy schools, and those schools were full. Around 5,000 medical students were learning surgery, anatomy, and how the human body actually worked on the inside, not from drawings in books but from real bodies, opened up on real tables, in rooms lit by tallow candles. That was how surgery was taught. That was the only way it could be taught properly. A diagram can show you where the heart sits. It cannot show you how it feels to hold one. The law said that the only bodies available for this kind of teaching were those of executed murderers. Since 1752, a law known as the Murder Act had allowed dissection as an additional punishment for the worst crimes. The idea was that it added shame to death, one more shadow hanging over the families left behind, a way of saying that even after the hanging, the state was not finished. But by the 1820s, the number of executions had actually dropped, while the number of students had kept climbing. Some years the anatomy schools across all of Scotland might receive 2 or 3 legal bodies between them. That number could not come close to covering what 5,000 students needed to learn from. Private anatomy schools had no way around this through official channels. They could not apply to a hospital for bodies. They could not receive the unclaimed dead from a workhouse. The law simply had not made any allowance for them. So the gap between what the schools needed and what the law allowed stayed open, stayed wide, and stayed very, very quiet. And into that gap walked a particular kind of man. We tend to picture him as a criminal, something rough and desperate, but that is not quite right. The men who supplied the anatomy schools, the ones people called resurrection men, ran what was in many ways a skilled trade. They knew which graveyards were watched and which were not. They knew how to read soil and how to move through the city at 2 a.m. without drawing attention. They had contacts inside the schools and contacts inside the churchyards, and they kept those 2 sets of contacts carefully apart. A fisherman knows the tides well enough to trust his life to them. These men knew the graveyards the same way. By day, Edinburgh looked exactly like itself. Families buried their dead. Ministers gave sermons. Surgeons stood at chalkboards and explained the chambers of the heart to rows of students writing in notebooks. The city had its rhythms. It had its surface. But the surface always had an underside. And after dark, the underside ran on its own schedule entirely. The families in the churchyard knew that schedule. They were sitting on that cold grass, not out of excessive worry, but because they knew, specifically and personally, what happened to unguarded graves after midnight. It had happened to someone they knew, a neighbour, a cousin, a person from their close, whose grave had looked undisturbed in the morning, but whose family had found, when they looked more carefully, that the earth had been turned and carefully replaced. That knowledge was not rumour. It was a local fact that shaped every decision a family made in the days after a burial. To understand the other side of that equation, you need to step inside one of those anatomy schools and see exactly what was waiting at the front of the room. The room at the front of Surgeon Square tells you everything you need to know. The bench under you is hard, worn smooth by years of students shifting their weight. And the room is not large. Maybe 60 people are packed into it, shoulder to shoulder, notebooks open, and the smell is of tallow candles burning down to their last inch, of cold stone and of something else underneath that you cannot quite name yet. At the front, a man draws the outline of a human chest on a chalkboard with quick, confident strokes. He does not look at his audience when he draws. He knows they are watching. That man is Robert Knox, and his school at Surgeon Square is the busiest anatomy school in Edinburgh. Students travel from London to sit in this room, and some come from further than that. Knox has a reputation for always having fresh material to teach from, and in anatomy, fresh material means everything. A drawing on a chalkboard can show you the shape of a lung. It cannot show you the weight of one, or the way the tissue tears, or what a healthy one looks like compared to one that has been killing someone slowly all winter. For that, you need the real thing. So, Knox always had the real thing. That was the arrangement, and it worked, and nobody in this room asked too many questions about how it worked. The law had tried to solve this problem back in 1752. A piece of legislation called the Murder Act said that the bodies of executed murderers could be handed over to anatomy schools after hanging. The idea was that dissection added another layer of punishment to the worst crimes, making the sentence feel even heavier. And for a while, it was enough. But by the 1820s, two things had shifted in opposite directions simultaneously. The number of executions across Scotland had dropped because the courts were sending fewer people to the gallows for lesser crimes, and the number of medical students had kept climbing year after year as Edinburgh grew and its medical reputation drew people from across Britain. The result was a gap you could drive a cart through. We share this space with thousands of others, yet the law only gives the doctor a handful of bodies each year. Knox had over 5,000 students moving through his school, and the legal supply of cadavers came to fewer than 25 bodies annually, shared between every school in the country. A single busy dissecting room needed far more than that, just to keep its students working through a normal term. Private schools like Knox's had no official way to close that gap. They could not write to a hospital and request unclaimed bodies, and the law had made no provision for them to arrange anything with a workhouse either. There was no official channel, no authority with the power to help them, and no legal route that existed at all. So the back door did the work instead. A body would arrive at the rear of the school after dark, carried by men who did not give their names. Knox's assistants would check the body's condition, agree on a price, and pay in coin on the spot. Nothing went into the school's records that might raise a question later, because the entire point of the transaction was that it left no trail, no name, no origin, nothing that could be followed back to anyone who mattered. The men left, and by morning the dissecting room had what it needed for the day's teaching. Knox paid well, and that mattered more than people might think. A fresh adult body in the late 1820s fetched around £3 and 10 shillings at his school. And to put that in some kind of shape, a working man in Edinburgh doing hard physical labour might earn something close to that in a full month. So one successful night's work could match a month of carrying, lifting and hauling, because the city's labour market offered nothing else that came close. That kind of money does not sit quietly in a person's thinking. It makes the cold and the risk feel different when you weigh them against what lies on the other side. And so people answered. Not reckless people mostly. Not desperate people acting without thought. The men who built a steady working relationship with Knox's school were, in their own way, professional about it. They learned which graveyards were watched and which were not. They learned the right nights and the right windows of time, and they learned how to move through the city at 1 a.m. carrying something heavy without attracting the kind of attention that ended badly. Over time, people learned that this was a trade you could be good at, and being good at it paid. Knox's school ran on this supply, the way a mill runs on water. When the supply was steady, the school was steady. Lectures filled up, students completed their dissection hours, and Knox's reputation for consistently delivering a rigorous practical education continued to draw new students in. Those students kept paying their fees, and those fees kept Knox able to pay his suppliers. The whole thing turned on itself quietly, and from the outside the school just looked like a very successful place to study medicine. Almost routine, you might say, almost ordinary. A school with good teachers, good students, and a steady supply of what it needed to function. And the fact that the supply came through a back door in the dark, from men whose names never appeared in any record, was a detail that the school's public face did not include. We will come back to Knox. His story does not stay this tidy, and the men who supplied him were not all running the same kind of careful, graveyard-based operation. But before that part of the night arrives, you need to understand what the actual work looked like from the ground up, because what the resurrection men did in the churchyards of Edinburgh required a kind of knowledge that took months to build. It started with learning to read the ground itself, and that meant going to the graveyards before the digging ever began. You pull your coat tighter and step through the gate of Greyfriars churchyard just as the last of the light drains from the sky. The cold comes up from the cold clay here, not down from the air. Your boots press into earth that has been walked, dug, and settled over so many generations that the ground level has actually risen over the centuries. A slow creep upward, built from more than 100,000 burials, laid several layers deep, one above another, until the yard sits noticeably higher than the street outside its walls. The yard is uneven because of it, tilting and humped in places, and in the grey last light it looks like something that has been breathing slowly for a very long time. The first thing you do is not look for a grave. You look at the ground. This is the skill that took months to build and could not be written down or passed along in any direct way. You either learned it by doing it, night after night, or you did not learn it at all. A resurrection man read a churchyard the way a good carpenter reads wood grain, by texture, by colour, by the way the surface behaved when the light caught it at a low angle, building up a picture of which patches of cold clay had been turned recently and which had been sitting undisturbed for years. It sounds simple. It was not simple. It took time to understand what you were actually seeing, because Earth does not announce itself. It just sits there, and you have to know what to ask it. Fresh Earth behaves differently from Earth that has been settled for months or years. A grave dug within the last week will have soil that still sits slightly raised, even after the sexton, the man whose job it was to dig and maintain the graves, has tamped it back down as flat as he could get it. The ground around a new burial is looser than the ground beside it. After rain, disturbed earth holds its darker colour longer than undisturbed earth does, so a fresh grave stays visibly different from the muffled soil next to it for days, if you know to look for the contrast. In dry weather, the edges of a newly cut grave stay crisp, the line between the dug soil and the untouched ground still sharp and clean. Old graves were no use at all. A body buried more than 2 weeks ago, even in Edinburgh's cold clay, had moved too far along to be of any use to an anatomy school. The schools wanted freshness, so the resurrection men learned to date a grave just by looking at it from a standing position, without touching anything, without drawing attention to themselves. The markers helped too. A headstone that was still pale and clean, not yet darkened by rain and moss, told you the grave was recent. A bunch of flowers at the head end that were wilted but still holding their shape, not yet brown and collapsed, pointed to a burial within the last few days. And that single detail, a flower arrangement still soft enough to bend rather than crumble, could tell you more than an hour of careful observation from a distance. And a family sitting nearby on the grass, wrapped in coats and not moving, told you to note the location and come back tomorrow or the day after, when the watch had tired and the grave had ripened a little further toward the right window. In Edinburgh's cold clay, that window ran up to about 2 weeks in winter, so the men who knew this worked a rotation. They visited the same churchyards over several days running, not to do anything, just to walk and look and remember. A grave they had noted on Monday might not be worth moving on until Thursday. They held this information in their heads because writing it down anywhere would have been a serious mistake. They also knew the yard's layout in a way most visitors didn't. Churchyards had patterns to them. The sections near the main paths and the church door tended to hold the graves of families with money, families who could afford a proper stone, a mort safe, or a long, organised watch. Mort safes were heavy iron cages bolted over a coffin to stop exactly this kind of work, and we will get to those properly a little later. The sections further back, near the walls, away from the main paths, often held the graves of the poor. Poor families could not afford iron cages or nights of organised watching. Their graves, by plain necessity, were more open. That knowledge was not something the resurrection men talked about or wrote down either. It was just built into the route, a quiet fact that shaped which direction you walked when you came through the gate. So before a single shovel came out, a resurrection man had already put in hours of careful, patient work. Walking slowly, stopping to crouch and look at the angle of the light on a patch of cold clay, noting a flower arrangement, a stone colour, a family's posture. The actual digging, when it finally came, was almost a straightforward part of the whole job. You crouch now near a mound close to the eastern wall. The soil is dark and slightly raised, not by much, maybe the height of your hand laid flat, but enough. The flowers at the head end are wilted, soft and bending, but the colour has not gone out of them yet. You press 2 fingers into the earth near the edge of the mound and feel it give just a little too easily under the pressure, the way soil does when it has been turned recently and has not had time to pack back down properly. You stay crouched for a moment longer. Somewhere near the south gate, a lantern flickers once inside the watchhouse window and goes still. You stand up and say nothing to the man behind you. You both already know. You will be back here after midnight, and whether that goes smoothly depends entirely on the man sitting inside that watchhouse and what arrangement has already been made with him. The man in the watchhouse by the south gate is someone you have known for 2 years, and in all that time you have never nodded to him on the street, never caught his eye at the market, never let on in any way that you know his name, or his face, or the particular way he clears his throat when he wants to signal that the yard is clear. In daylight, you're strangers. That is the arrangement, and the arrangement has held because both of you need it to. Every major churchyard in Edinburgh by the 1820s had some kind of watch running through the night. Some parishes built proper stone watch houses, small rooms set into the churchyard wall with a fire inside and a narrow window facing out over the graves. Some families took turns sitting through the dark hours themselves. 2 or 3 people at a stretch, handing the watch off like a relay. Some communities pulled money to pay a man a regular wage to do it every night, someone who knew the yard well and could be trusted to stay awake. The watch house at Greyfriars had a fire going most nights in winter, and the glow of it sat in the window like a small orange eye looking out over the graves. The watch exists to stop exactly what you're planning to do tonight. That was its whole purpose, and most of the men who sat that watch took it seriously enough. They had been hired by frightened families who had buried someone they loved, and needed to know the grave would still be undisturbed in the morning. So the watch was not a formality. It was a real thing, with real people behind it, and you never forgot that when you were working. but a night's watch paid very little. A shilling, sometimes two, for a full night sitting in a cold stone room with a fire that burned down to ash by 3 in the morning. The men who took those jobs were not wealthy. They were ordinary working men filling a gap between other work, and a shilling was a shilling. Joseph Naples, one of the more careful operators in this trade, noted that you could offer a watchman considerably more than his nightly wage just for an hour of looking the other way, and some men, not all of them, but enough of them, found that a persuasive offer. A shilling to watch the yard all night, or 2 shillings simply to walk the far side of it between midnight and 1. The arithmetic was not complicated. Not every watchman took money. Some were genuinely loyal to the families who had hired them, and you learned over time which men those were, because approaching the wrong watchman even once could end your working nights in Edinburgh very quickly. So you built your knowledge carefully. You watched, you listened, you waited until you were sure. And when you found a man who would take the arrangement, you built it into your planning the way any tradesman builds the cost of materials into a job, as a fixed fact, not a gamble. The signals were simple because simple things are harder to mistake in the dark. A lantern placed in a particular window meant the yard was being watched as normal. Stay away. A lantern removed from that window, leaving it dark, meant the watchman had taken the coin, and the arrangement was in place. Sometimes it was a sound, a cough at a specific time, or a stone left in a certain spot near the gate before nightfall to confirm the plan was still holding. The coin itself sometimes served as the signal, left under a flat stone beside the path, with the understanding that finding it meant the watchman would find a reason to walk the far side of the yard between midnight and 1 in the morning, leaving the eastern section, where you planned to work, unobserved for long enough. Between the members of your own gang, the signals ran on a different tool entirely. A dark lantern was the standard piece of kit, a regular lantern fitted with a sliding iron panel on one side. You could feel the panel under your thumb, cold and slightly rough where the metal had pitted from use, and pushing it across cut the light down to almost nothing, while pulling it back let the wicks glow out in a controlled flash that carried just far enough. 1 flash meant the path ahead was clear to move. 2 flashes meant stop and wait. Something had moved, or a sound had come from the wrong direction. 3 flashes meant scatter, go separate ways, do not run, but walk fast and do not come back tonight. You rehearsed the meaning of those signals until they lived in your body rather than your head, because in the moment there was no time to think it through. Your boots mattered more than most people would guess. Edinburgh's old town was built on stone, and leather soles on cobblestones at 1 in the morning carried further than you would expect on a still night. The tenements on either side of the closes rose 5 and 6 floors above the street, and sound bounced between those walls in ways that were hard to predict. So before you left the close, you wrapped your boots in strips of sackcloth, coarse cloth that scratched against the leather as you tied them firm but not tight. The weave thick enough to muffle the ring of each footstep on the stone without letting you slip on wet cobbles. The whole system held together because no records were kept and none of it was spoken about openly. It lived in gestures and timing and the weight of a coin under a stone. If you were inside the network, you knew how to read those signals and what each one meant in which yard on which night. If you were outside it, the churchyard looked completely still. A watchman doing his rounds, a lantern in a window, nothing moving in the dark. Tonight, the coin is already under the stone by the south gate path. The lantern in the watchhouse window is dark. The yard is yours between midnight and 1, and the eastern wall is waiting. All that is left now is the work itself, and the work starts the moment your shovel goes into the ground. The shovel goes in at an angle, not straight down, and the cold of the iron handle comes through your gloves and through the rags wrapped around them and sits in your palms anyway. The ground here is heavy. Edinburgh's churchyard soil is clay mixed with gravel, and it does not give the way loose garden earth does. It grabs the blade and holds it, and you have to work the handle back and forth a little to free each scoop. You do this slowly, because slow is quiet, and quiet is the only thing keeping you here. The technique most people imagine, digging up an entire grave from end to end, would take the better part of a night and leave a hole that anyone walking through the yard at dawn would spot immediately. That was not how this worked. You dig only at the head end, cutting a narrow trench straight down to the top of the coffin, just wide enough to work in, maybe 2 feet across. The rest of the grave stays undisturbed, packed and settled, looking from any distance like nothing has been touched. Each shovelful comes up and goes onto the canvas sheet spread beside the trench, not dropped, placed as quietly as you can manage, one load next to the last in the same order they came out, because when the work is done, every scoop goes back into the trench in reverse, bottom first, and the ground needs to sit right when you're finished. The canvas catches what would otherwise scatter across the grass and give you away. On a dry night, it works well. On a wet night, when the clay is heavier and sticks to itself in slabs rather than breaking apart cleanly, the canvas slips, and the mud wants to go where you do not want it to go, and the whole thing takes longer and costs more effort than you have budgeted for. Tonight, the ground is cold but not soaked. The clay breaks apart with some persuasion. You are maybe 18 inches down when you feel the shovel tip catch something that does not feel like stone or root, a flatter, more even resistance. You switch to your hands and clear the last few inches by feel, brushing the soil back from the lid's surface. Working the flat iron hook under the edge of the lid near the head end is the most patient part. A crowbar would split the wood in seconds, but the crack of green timber giving way under iron carries across a quiet yard the way a shout would. The hook needs to seat properly before you pull, and that takes time because the fit is tight. Tonight, your fingers find something unexpected as you work it in. A ridge of cold iron running along the inside edge of the lid, a collar bolted to the coffin to stop exactly this kind of leverage. You feel it in the dark before you understand what it is. Metal against metal, the hook skating sideways instead of catching. You reset, work the hook further along toward the corner where the collar ends, and try again. Once it seats, you lean back on the rope slowly, not in a single pull but in a long steady pressure, and the wood bends before it gives, creaking rather than snapping, a low sound that stays low and fades quickly into the fog. The body comes out wrapped in a burial shroud, white linen wound close, and you can hear it as it moves, a soft drag of cloth against the raw wood. And then the weight shifts towards you all at once as the shoulders clear the lip of the coffin. The shroud stays behind. Every man in your gang knows this without being told, because it is one of the first things you learn in this trade. The shroud belongs to whoever paid for it. Taking it is theft, a real charge that a magistrate will act on. Taking the body is something else entirely, because under the law as it stands, a body has no owner. No one can claim it as their property, so you leave the linen in the coffin, folded back, and you take only what the law cannot call yours to begin with. It is a practical piece of knowledge, not a moral position, and you hold it the same way you hold everything else useful, quietly and without making a point of it. You are working with 2 other men tonight. One is at the gate, still watching the south path for any change in the dark, any sound that should not be there. The other manages the canvas and the sacking, keeping it flat, keeping the soil ordered, and getting the body sack ready. You rotate the digging every few minutes, not because any single man cannot handle it alone, but because the work is hard enough that tired arms make noise, and noise is the one thing you cannot afford right now. When your arms start to feel the weight of the clay, you pass the shovel without a word, step back, shake out your hands, and breathe slowly. The whole process, from the first push of the shovel into the ground to the last of the soil patted back down over a filled trench, takes an experienced gang about 45 minutes on ground like this. Wet nights, cold nights when the clay freezes into a crust just below the surface. Nights when the hook will not seat and has to be worked in again from a different angle. Those nights stretch past an hour and eat into the window the watchman has left you. Tonight it runs clean. The trench fills back in the right order. You press the canvas down over the last layer and tamp it with the flat of the shovel. Not hard, just enough. In the dark, the ground looks almost as it did when you arrived. A slight disturbance at the head end that will settle further by morning and look, in daylight, like nothing more than the natural unevenness of a new grave. The body goes into a long sack tied at both ends. 2 men carry it between them, one at each end, holding the rope ties, and it hangs between you like a heavy roll of carpet. It is heavier than most people expect when they first use it. An adult body in burial clothes, even with the shroud left behind, weighs enough to slow your pace on wet cobblestones if you let it pull you off balance. The canvas is folded and tucked under one arm. The gate ahead is dark and still, and the route to Surgeon's Square runs through the closes of the old town. 3 streets, 1 back lane, and whatever the fog is hiding tonight. The fog sits low over the closes tonight, thick enough to turn the lantern ahead of you into a smear of orange light floating in grey. Your boots are still wrapped in sackcloth. Your breath comes out in slow clouds, and the sack between you and the man ahead sways a little with each step as you adjust your grip on the rope tie to keep the weight from pulling you sideways on the wet cobbles. Greyfriars to Surgeon Square is not a long walk by Edinburgh standards, maybe 15 minutes on a clear day with nothing in your hands. Tonight it is something else entirely, because every step of it runs through the living city, and the city at 1 in the morning is not as empty as people who sleep through it might think. Edinburgh's closes and wynds, the narrow passages and back lanes that cut between the tall tenements of the old town, had people moving through them at all hours. Night workers finishing a late shift at a printing house or a tannery, men coming out of taverns, not loud, just quiet and slow, making their way home along the walls. Women are carrying water up from a lower floor to a higher floor, because the building supply ran out hours ago. The city did not stop. It just got quieter and spread itself thinner, and you moved through the thinner version of it with your bundle, your sackcloth boots, and your dark lantern held low. The sack was your cover, and it was a good one because Edinburgh's economy ran on night deliveries. Printers needed paper moved after dark. Tanners shifted hides in heavy packing crates. The wood damp and sharp smelling from the yard. 2 men needed to lift each one. bakers received flour before anyone else woke up. 2 men carrying something heavy through a back lane at 1 in the morning looked like exactly what the city expected to see, so nobody looked twice at the shape of the load or asked what was inside. You dressed like a tradesman and moved like one, steady and purposeful, not hurrying, not slinking, just 2 men doing a job on a cold night. The weight was the problem. A roll of cloth, a bundle of hides, a sack of flour. None of those shift and settle the way a body does when you change your grip or step over a raised cobble. There is a particular quality to the weight of a person, a kind of uneven, soft heaviness that does not behave like goods, and anyone who has ever lifted one would know it immediately. Most people had not, but occasionally someone paid real attention, and there are accounts of gangs being stopped mid-route by a suspicious night watchman who wanted to know what was in the sack, who pressed a hand against its side and felt something that did not feel right. Talking your way out of a close with a body between you required a specific kind of calm that not everyone could hold on to in the moment. The men who lasted in this trade were the ones who could. Surgeon's Square opens up at the end of a narrow lane, and after the tight press of the closes, it feels almost wide. The buildings around it are dark at this hour, except for 1 or 2 windows, where a candle still burns. A warm yellow square in the stone that tells you someone inside is working late, or cannot sleep, or both. Your sackcloth boots land softly on the cobbles of the square, quieter here than in the closes, and the fog sits between the buildings in a way that makes the whole place feel sealed off from the rest of the city. The back door of Knox's school sits in a particular corner of the square, and if you had been in the trade for any length of time, you knew exactly which door it was. You knock in a specific way, not loudly, and then you wait. After a moment, the door opens, and the smell of the dissecting room comes out to meet you before you're even fully inside. Cold stone, preserving spirits, and underneath those 2 things, something else that you had learned over time to simply not follow with your thoughts. Knox's assistants handled the deal. They quickly and professionally assessed the condition of the body, noting its approximate age and size, and pressed 2 fingers against the skin to determine how recently the burial had taken place. Then they named a price. The money came out in coins, counted into your palm on the spot. No paper changed hands. No names were spoken. The door had opened. The work had been inspected and valued. The coin had moved, and that was the whole of it. At the height of Knox's school, in the late 1820s, a particularly fresh adult body could fetch between £8 and £10. Split between a gang of 3 that still came out well above what a skilled labourer in Edinburgh could expect to earn in several months of regular work after covering the cost of the watchman's arrangement and any other expenses the night had required. 1 night, 1 trench, 1 walk across the old town, 1 knock at a back door in the fog. The money was real, and it sat in your coat pocket the whole way home. Inside the dissecting room, behind the door, already closing behind you, the candles were lit, and the table was ready. Students would arrive in the morning to find fresh material laid out, and Knox would stand at the front of the room and teach from it, and the school would run another day. The supply chain that made all of that possible had no official name and left no official record. It just worked night after night, quietly and reliably, until it did not. The coin is in your pocket now, heavy and warm from the assistant's hand. The fog has thickened further outside, sitting low over the closes and deadening every sound the city makes. You tuck the dark lantern under your arm and turn back toward the lane, and the tavern is waiting, and the peat fire inside it has been burning since before you left for the churchyard. But before you get there, you need to know about two men who worked in this same city at almost exactly this same time, and who took the whole arrangement somewhere it was never supposed to go. William Burke and William Hare were not resurrection men in the way you have spent this night being one. They never learned to read soil. They never wrapped their boots in sackcloth or worked a flat iron hook under a coffin lid in the dark. They found a faster route to the same market, and it had nothing to do with churchyards at all. As we walk, we try not to think of men like Burke and Hare, but the city that produced them is the same city you have been moving through tonight, and the back door you just left is the same back door they used. It started in November of 1827 in Hare's boarding house on Tanner's Close, not far from the old town. A lodger named Donald died there of natural causes, still owing £4 in rent. Hare's money was gone, and Donald had nothing left to collect it from, so Hare came up with a different way to recover what he was owed. He had heard, as most people in Edinburgh had heard, that Knox's school paid good money for a fresh body, no questions asked. Burke agreed to help. They took the lodger's body to Surgeon Square and walked away with £7 and 10 shillings between them, more than either of them had earned in weeks of ordinary work. That first time there had been a real death. A man died, and 2 other men took advantage of it. Uncomfortable, yes, but not yet something worse. The next time, though, there was no natural death to wait for. Burke and Hare began looking at the people around them differently after that first payment. Elderly lodgers who had no family nearby, strangers passing through the city with no one to ask after them. People who were already drinking heavily would not find it hard to get into a worse state. The boarding house became a place where vulnerable people were brought in off the street, settled into a room with strong drink, and made comfortable in a way that was not kindness. The method they settled on involved pressing a hand or a knee over the nose and mouth of a person who had drunk enough to be unable to fight back properly, smothering them in a way that left no bruising on the throat, no broken bones, nothing that a quick look at the body would catch as anything other than a person who had drunk too much and died quietly in their sleep. Knox's assistants inspected the bodies the same way they always had. They checked the condition, checked the freshness, agreed on a price, and paid in coin. The bodies Burke and Hare delivered arrived in good condition and were recently dead, with no marks that a surface inspection would turn up, so Knox paid. Between November 1827 and October 1828, Burke and Hare killed 16 people this way, and 16 bodies went through the back door of Knox's school, and Knox's school kept running, and Knox kept teaching, and none of it surfaced until almost a full year had passed. The word that came out of it later was Burking. It entered the English language as a term for a particular kind of quiet suppression, the kind that leaves no obvious marks, the kind where something is smothered rather than broken. Politicians used it. Journalists used it. It spread well past Edinburgh and well past the 1820s, because the idea of it, that quiet, pressing, traceless ending, turned out to be a useful image for other things people wanted to describe. Burke himself was long gone by the time the word really took hold, but the word stayed. The case came apart in October 1828. Lodgers at Hare's house found a body hidden under a bed and went directly to the police. When the police arrived and started asking questions, the arrangement between Burke and Hare cracked open almost immediately. Hare agreed to turn King's evidence, meaning he agreed to testify against Burke in exchange for a pardon for himself. It was a clean trade from Hare's point of view. He walked away. Burke did not. Burke's trial drew enormous attention across Scotland, and on the days the verdict was expected, people pressed into the streets, outside the courthouse, from early morning, standing in the cold rain with their collars up, listening for any sound from inside the building that might carry through the open windows above them. He was convicted of the murder of a woman named Mary Docherty, whose body had been the one found under the bed, and sentenced to death with the added condition that his body be handed over for public dissection afterwards. That condition came directly from the Murder Act of 1752, the same law that had created the shortage of legal bodies in the first place, by limiting dissection to executed murderers. Burke had spent a year supplying anatomy schools with murder victims. Now he would supply one himself. On the 28th of January, 1829, Burke was hanged in Edinburgh in front of a crowd estimated at between 25,000 and 30,000 people. They pressed into the streets from before dawn, climbing walls and rooftops and leaning out of windows. It was one of the largest crowds the city had seen in years, and they were not there to mourn him. What made Burke and Hare different from every other supplier working Edinburgh's graveyards was not simply that they killed people. It was their method that produced bodies that looked exactly like natural deaths. Whether Knox genuinely noticed nothing over the course of a full year, or whether he noticed and chose to keep the back door open anyway, is something Edinburgh debated long after the trial ended and his name had been dragged through every conversation in the city. Hare walked free and disappeared from public record almost immediately after giving his testimony. There are scattered accounts of someone matching his description being recognised in various places over the years that followed, chased by crowds who knew his face, living quietly under other names. None of it was ever confirmed. He simply stopped being findable and stayed that way. Burke's story had one more chapter after the hanging. But before we get there, we need to go back to the family sitting on the cold grass in the afternoon light, because what they built to protect their dead tells you more about this city than almost anything else. A mort safe is the first thing you notice when you look carefully at the older sections of a churchyard, like Greyfriars. It sits over a grave the way a lid sits over something that needs to stay shut. Heavy iron bars welded into a rigid frame. The metal dark with age and cold to the touch, bolted directly into the ground, so that the weight of it presses down into the clay and says, plainly, that this family decided the ground here was not going to be disturbed. Some safes use solid iron plates riveted together at every edge, with a lock requiring two separate keys held by two different people, so that no single person could open it alone. They were not decorative, they were not ceremonial, they were the shape of a specific fear made out of iron and left there long after the fear itself had passed. But the mort safe was not where the arms race started. Before the heavy iron cages, families used simpler things. A mort stone was a flat slab of stone, heavy enough to need several men to shift, laid directly over the coffin before the grave was filled in. It would not stop a determined gang with time and equipment, but it added enough difficulty to make a quicker, easier grave more attractive. Coffin collars, iron rings bolted around the neck of the coffin itself, were another early answer, designed to stop the body from being dragged out by a hook through the head end of the lid. You felt one of those earlier tonight, in the dark, your hook skating sideways off the metal instead of catching. The families who could afford even these simpler measures used them. The families who could not afford them sat in the yard instead. And as the resurrection men got better at working around the simpler obstacles, the families who had money went further, and the iron got heavier, and the locks got more complicated. They were not cheap. A mort safe could cost more than a working Edinburgh family spent on rent in an entire year, sometimes more. And yet families paid for them, scraped the money together, borrowed it if they had to, because the alternative was a grave left open to the night, a loved one dug up in the dark, carried across the city in a sack, laid out on a stone table in a candlelit room full of students writing in notebooks. That was not an abstract fear in 1820s Edinburgh. It was a specific, local, well-known thing that had happened to people they knew personally. The fear ran deeper than the practical side of it, though. Many people in this period believed that the body needed to stay whole and intact for resurrection, for the moment they expected to come when the dead would rise and be reunited with their souls. Dissection did not just feel like an indignity. For a lot of families, it felt like something being taken that could never be given back, a permanent damage to something that still mattered even after death. So the mort safe was not only about stopping an anatomy school from getting a body, it was about protecting something that felt sacred, something that the law had failed to protect on their behalf. Not every family could afford a mort safe of their own, so some churchyards adopted a shared version. A communal mort safe would be placed over a new grave immediately after the burial and left there for several weeks, until the body had moved past the point where any anatomy school would want it. Then it got lifted and moved to the next family's grave, rented out again, doing its work for whoever needed it next. It was a practical solution built by communities who understood that the risk was real and that most of their members could not face it alone. In Aberdeenshire, at a place called Udny Green, the community went further than a cage. They built a circular stone building right inside the churchyard, a mort house, where new coffins were stored after a burial under lock and key. Inside, a wooden turntable held up to 7 coffins at once, rotating as new arrivals came in, so that each coffin moved around the wheel in order until enough time had passed that the body inside would no longer be of use to anyone looking to sell it. Only then did the coffin go into the ground. It sounds extreme. In that period, in that county, it was just practical. Watch houses grew up alongside the mort safes, built into the walls of churchyards across Scotland, small stone rooms with a narrow window facing the graves, a fireplace inside stocked with coal, and sometimes a bottle of whiskey to help a man sit through the cold hours between midnight and 4. Some watch houses had a gun loop cut into the wall beside the window, a narrow angled slot that let a man train a musket across the yard without opening the door and giving himself away. The watch sat in shifts, scanning the yard through the glass for any movement in the dark, and in some parishes the watch house was built solidly enough to last a century. You can still find them in Scottish churchyards today, tucked into corners of walls, their windows still facing outward. The heaviest mort safes weighed several £100. Moving one required a block and tackle, a system of ropes and pulleys that let a small group of men lift something far heavier than they could manage by hand. And even then, the work took time and made noise. Time and noise were the two things a resurrection man working inside a 1-hour window simply could not spend. so the mort safe worked the way a lock works, not because it was unbeatable, but because breaking it cost more than the job was worth. Those iron frames are still there now, at New Calton and at Greyfriars, sitting in the grass beside the graves they once covered. You walked past them this afternoon, your hand brushing the cold gate, and they were already there then in the daylight, while the city moved around them. The families who paid for them are long gone. The fear that built them is not quite as gone as it looks. Edinburgh was not the only city living with that fear, though. The same shortage, the same gap between what medicine needed and what the law allowed, ran through every city in Britain with an anatomy school in it. London had its own version of everything Edinburgh had. Private anatomy schools, crowded lecture halls, instructors who needed fresh material to teach from, and no legal way to get enough of it. The Bethnal Green Gang worked London's East End in the same period, moving through the city's overcrowded churchyards, the way Edinburgh's resurrection men move through Greyfriars and the New Calton burial ground. They read the same kind of soil, used the same kind of tools, and delivered to back doors in the same kind of dark. The work looked almost identical because the problem driving it was identical. London's churchyards were, in some ways, easier to work than Edinburgh's. The city spread across so many more parishes, and oversight was thinner and harder to coordinate across boroughs and local authorities. A gang could work a churchyard in Bethnal Green one week and move to Southwark the next, and no single watchman or parish officer would see a pattern forming. Edinburgh was smaller and denser, so the men working there had to be more careful about rotating their locations and timing. London offered more room to spread the work out and stay harder to track. But London also produced its own version of what Burke and Hare had done in Edinburgh. Cases where the line between supplying anatomy schools and creating the supply yourself stopped being a line at all. The London Burkers, as they came to be known, followed the same logic Burke and Hare had followed, because the same back door was open and the same money was waiting on the other side. When those cases surfaced, the public reaction followed the same pattern as in Scotland, with outrage directed not just at the individuals involved, but at the whole arrangement that had made their actions possible. A system that paid good money for a fresh body and asked nothing about where it came from was a system that created a particular kind of temptation, and London found that out the same way Edinburgh had. The bodies moved between cities too, and that is the part of this trade that most people do not picture when they think about it. Edinburgh suppliers shipped bodies south in barrels and packing crates, the wood damp and cold from sitting in a yard, heavy enough that 2 men were needed to load each one onto a coach. The crates were labelled as goods. The paperwork described something ordinary. A carter loaded them without knowing, or in some cases perhaps without wanting to know, what was inside. The body trade had a logistics network, with regular customers, preferred suppliers, and established routes for moving the goods from one city to another without drawing attention at any point along the way. So what we are looking at when we step back from Edinburgh and take in the whole of Britain in the 1820s is not a handful of desperate men doing something strange in the margins of society. It was a functioning informal market spread across multiple cities, operating with enough regularity and organisation to have suppliers, buyers, transport arrangements, and pricing that both sides understood. The shortage the law had created was real and nationwide, and the market that filled it behaved as markets do when demand is high and official supply is nowhere near enough. The outrage that followed Burke and Hare's trial in early 1829 was not confined to Edinburgh. It spread across Scotland and then across England because people reading the reports understood that what had happened in Tanner's Close was not a local accident. It was what the whole system risked producing anywhere it operated. Knox's school had paid no questions asked, and 16 people had died because of it. But Knox's school was not the only school paying no questions asked, and Edinburgh was not the only city where the back door opened after dark for men carrying heavy sacks. Parliament moved, not quickly and not without argument, but the Burke and Hare case pushed a debate that had been sitting unresolved for years into a place where it could no longer stay unresolved. In 1832, the Anatomy Act was passed into law, and it changed the legal supply of bodies for dissection by allowing anatomy schools to receive the unclaimed bodies of people who died in workhouses. Unclaimed meant exactly that. People with no family to ask after them, no one to leave flowers on a mound of cold earth, no one to sit through a night watch or pay for an iron cage. People who had ended up in a workhouse because they had nothing left and nowhere else to go, and who died there the same way, quietly and without anyone to object on their behalf. The grave-robbing market collapsed, so the economics no longer worked. When a school could legally and cheaply receive unclaimed bodies, paying £3, £8 or £10 to a man at the back door, in the dark stopped making sense. The resurrection. Men lost their market the way any supplier loses one. Something cheaper and easier replaced what they were selling. The Anatomy Act had a cost though, and it did not fall on the anatomy schools or on the men who had been supplying them. The fear that wealthy families had managed to protect themselves from, with iron mort safes, paid watches, and stone watch houses, did not go away. It moved. It moved downward onto the people in the workhouses, the people who had always carried the most of it and had the least ability to do anything about it. The families who had sat on the cold grass in the churchyard, watching over graves they could not afford to cage in iron, had been right to be afraid. The law had simply decided that someone else should be afraid instead, and one man, more than any other, had made that law feel necessary. His story had one more chapter left, and it ended before 30,000 people on a cold January morning. Burke went to the gallows on the 28th of January, 1829, and the city came out to watch in a way that Edinburgh had not seen in a long time. People arrived before the sun came up, pressing into the street below the scaffold from every direction, climbing onto walls and rooftops and leaning from windows to get a clear line of sight. The crowd that gathered numbered somewhere around 25,000 people, maybe more, and they were not quiet about it either. When Burke dropped, the sound that went up carried across the whole of the old town. After the hanging, Burke's body went to the University of Edinburgh, handed over for public dissection under the exact same law that had created the shortage of legal bodies in the first place. The Murder Act of 1752 had said that executed murderers could be given to anatomy schools as an extra punishment, something added on top of the hanging itself, something meant to feel like a final permanent indignity. Burke had spent the better part of a year supplying bodies to anatomy schools. Now he was one. Tickets were sold to members of the public who wanted to watch the dissection, and they sold out. People filed into the dissecting room the same way they had filed into the courtroom, because the city was not finished with him yet. Alexander Monroe, the professor of anatomy at the university, and Knox's long-standing rival, performed the dissection while people watched from the tiered seating above the table. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment. Knox had received Burke's deliveries for nearly a year, paid for them, and built his school's reputation on having fresh material. It was Monroe, not Knox, who stood at the table when the city finally got its answer. By the time the dissection was finished, Burke's skeleton had been carefully separated and preserved, each bone cleaned and kept. That skeleton is still there. It sits in the University of Edinburgh's Anatomical Museum today, in a glass case clearly labelled. The label tells you his name and what he did. You can go and stand in front of it on an ordinary afternoon, with other visitors walking past behind you, and look at the bones of a man who was hanged in front of tens of thousands of people nearly 2 centuries ago. A small detail tells us something about how Edinburgh holds this story. The skeleton is not tucked away, not kept in a back room or brought out only for special occasions. It is just there, in the museum, as part of the collection. There's also a small pocketbook in the same museum, and its cover is not made of paper or cloth. According to the museum's own records, it is covered in Burke's skin, tanned after the dissection, and bound smooth as any other piece of worked leather, sitting quietly in its case beside the label that carries his name. A visiting card case made from the same material was given to a police officer who had worked on the case. These objects exist. They are documented. They sit in the same city where Burke walked through the closes at night with Hare. And the fact that they exist at all tells you something about how the city felt in the months after the trial, how much anger had built up, and how it looked for somewhere to go. Knox was never charged with anything. A public inquiry reviewed the evidence and found it insufficient to prosecute him, and on paper that closed the matter. But Edinburgh did not close it. People stopped attending his lectures. The students who had travelled from across Britain to sit in his room at Surgeon Square stopped coming, and the room that had once been packed shoulder to shoulder emptied out over the months that followed the trial. The students left, the square went quiet, and eventually the doctor had to leave too. Knox stayed in Edinburgh for a while, trying to rebuild what he had lost, but the city had made up its mind about him and did not change it. He moved to London and spent the rest of his working life there, never quite getting back to the position he had held before October 1828. When the lodgers at Hare's boarding house found a body under a bed and went to the police, Hare's story ends differently, which is to say, it does not really end at all. He walked free after giving his testimony against Burke, protected by the deal he had made, and then he simply disappeared from the record. There are scattered reports, none confirmed, of a man matching his description being recognised in various places over the years that followed, chased by crowds who knew his face, and living quietly under other names in other cities. Nothing solid ever came out of those accounts. Hare stopped being findable almost as soon as the trial ended, and whatever became of him stayed private. So the 3 men at the centre of the case went 3 different ways. Burke went to the gallows, then to the dissecting table, and finally to a glass case in a museum. Knox lost everything he had built and spent years trying to recover it in a city that had already moved on. Hare walked out of the courtroom and into a kind of permanent absence, his story dissolving into rumour and unverified sightings until there was nothing left to confirm. In a quiet corner of that museum, the bones of a man who supplied the anatomy schools now teach anatomy himself, in the only way left to him, displayed in a case beside the label that carries his name, offering what his body always offered to the schools that paid for it, just without the back door, and the coin counted into a waiting hand. The night's work is done, and somewhere across the old town a peat fire is still burning. The tavern is close, and the warmth of it reaches you before you're even fully inside. A low earthy glow from a peat fire banked up in the corner, the kind that gets into your coat and your boots all at once. The fire settles, and softly you can hear the city outside, a cart moving somewhere on the wet cobbles, a door closing 2 streets over, the fog sitting low over the closes and the churchyards, and deadening every sound the old town makes at this hour, while somewhere near the south gate a watchman is still walking his rounds, coat pulled tight, lantern in hand. If tonight's story brought back a memory of your own, or if you found comfort here, tap subscribe and like the video. It helps others find a warm place to rest too. And if you'd like, share softly in the comments where you find peace when the nights grow long.